That was wonderful, and I feel like I need to spend about a week beginning to even try to digest and think about it.
Sorry,
so
it was just so...
No, I mean, this is good.
I didn't know, I couldn't give you a piece of the paradigm. I didn't know how to do it. Later on,
but I wanted to ask you...
It's his fault, actually.
Yeah. I want to ask you a question which is in part about the generalizability or portability of some of what you're suggesting. What I'm seeing here is a kind of historiographic opening that then, in terms of what you were saying about Hawthorne et al., closes later on in the history of the American novel. And I was wondering then about, you briefly mentioned Dickens. I mean, there are those major novelists who are excluded from the sort of Forster, et cetera, tradition, and there's great irony.
Well, F.R. Leavis calls him an entertainment.
Right, and it's a wonderful irony that you find the origins of that canon-making tradition in Scott, who himself gets excluded from it once it really gets established. But I was wondering about novelists like Dickens or, say, Victor Hugo in France, who clearly don't conform to the sort of biographical model of the novel as this sort of accumulation of property across the narrative. To me, listening to you had really interesting kind of resonances with some of these tropes and aspects that you're describing. Could you talk about that? How far might we think about novelists like that in terms of this sort of networked by a political model that you were suggesting?
Well, I've actually done a reading, we have done a reading of Jane Austen, a lot of 18th century British novels in these terms, just playfully, and we've published an essay on this, which is sort of like, I think, an overdue dismantling of desire in domestic fiction. You know, I mean, the book is so old it deserves to die, right? And so we show that Austen's, we're going to get to Dickens in a minute, but that Austen's households invariably begin in a state of instability that are caused by forces well outside the local shire. And that, you know, and the networks are always coming in. It's not just, you know, I know Edward Said opened this up, but it isn't just in Mansfield Park. It's when Frank Churchill goes to get a haircut, and you know, or a pianoforte comes in from someplace unexpected. So we've started reading everything this way, and really think that there is this sort of potential in every novel that is, or this, I don't know what to call it, this active narrative, these concepts are working in all the novels that matter to us, but a kind of tenacious liberalism has told us to read against that. There wouldn't, and I think that, you know, the two notions of form interact in England and in France very differently than they do in the United States. Okay, so I'm not saying it's all that there is one novel form or even one standard, but it seems to me that there wouldn't be any point in making a home if it hadn't been destroyed and disrupted and all these people put in jeopardy. So, you know, how do you, Austen seems to think that the only way of providing for human life is to reconstitute a more adequate household, for example. Dickens doesn't do that. I mean, the kind of economy, the network economy continues on, and he rescues one little piece, one little household that does operate that way. Say in Bleak House, there's this phony Bleak House that's nested in it. But it's, you know, his energy and the serial mode of production are much more inclined toward the kind of form that we're talking about. That's what he specializes in. especially character, those flat characters that, and Forster, in aspects of the novel, this is one of the clues that got us into this. He says, he doesn't have a real human being, a real live human being, anywhere in his novels. Dickens doesn't. But yet, that text is so vital, it's so full of life. So then he goes and starts psychologizing the author, because any kind of life has to originate or find its endpoint, its telos in an individual. So we don't think so. And so, yeah.
So I was really taken with the way that you're talking about immunization, and I wanted to sort of
What?
immunization.
Immunization.
Right. So the way you're talking
This is the
immunization-
translator of that.
Oh, surprise,
That
surprise.
damned little book. That infectious little book.
Yeah, well, it's not so little. But I wanted to pick up immunization, and one of the last things you said, which, as far as I understand it, is that there's in the modern American novel, there's more of that kind of immunization as opposed to these earlier. That's not.
No, it's quite the opposite. In
Okay.
fact, in Arthur Mervyn, there's the yellow fever in Philadelphia that creates all sorts of connections and destroys a lot of people in the process. So no, this is about infection. Social relationships work in these novels almost the way an epidemic does.
Okay, so
So I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear.
no. That's clear now. I guess maybe for me one of the confusing things then would be what you had mentioned earlier, which is the relation of plot to the form of the novel. Now, is that, if I understood what you're saying correctly, it's plot has some features that are linked to immunity,
Oh, yeah.
right? So I guess my question then is, are there, if I'm looking at these non-canonical novels that you're talking about, and then
Can we say narrative rather than plot? Would that work?
Well, I don't know. How would narrative be more of part of this immunitary paradigm than plot?
Well, narrative is not just what connects point A to point B
Yeah.
and that kind of thing, and
Yeah.
the order in which it occurs. But narrative is, a more aggressive, it's a process of articulation. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I guess maybe the difficulty for me is that I'm trying to come at this through poetry rather than through the
That
novel.
would be a problem.
Well, but I don't think so. I mean,
Well, I mean, but if you, I think poetry has a narrative in it, or, the well-wrought urn not only has the story of those people going to the funeral that are frozen in time, but there's also, the movement of the lyric persona's emotions. There's a movement of the.
Yeah, no. Tomorrow morning, 9:30. I'll tell you why I don't agree with you. But
No, I can't wait, because I'm a novel person.
no, I know you are, and I'm less a novel person.
Okay, no, this is good.
No, so anyway, my question ends there then. My question ends there then, because basically what I was trying to get to is in your terms, narrative is, what's at stake if narrative is immunizing the novel and the reader from this larger sense of community? I mean, for me, this is a question of what is it about the reader that somehow gets immunized by reading the novel?
I wouldn't say that the reader does. I mean,
Okay.
there are two. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, because there's all this discourse about the solitary
Right.
novel reader and that kind of thing. There's also, from the beginning of the novel, we're talking about an earlier period. There's this discourse about the infectious quality of the novel. If women read this novel, they're going to eat chocolates and get pregnant, that kind of thing. There are reading groups. There are imitators. I mean, before the copyright law really made an author, these novels were chopped up and disseminated. There's a Canadian Kenilworth, which is a blatant plagiarism of the novel. So I understand the two of them work against each other. I'm on the infectious side.
Okay.
That's all. I don't think it's wrong to say that. Deborah, you had your hand up a minute ago, and I was blowing past you.
I remain really interested in this question of how one can transfer this model to 19th century France. And I've been just reflecting on some other 19th century French novels where the dispersion of household objects is a culminating feature of the narrative. In Flaubert, for example, in Zola, in Balzac, auctions and the selling off of belongings is something that when you think about it, you almost always see, even in the novels that feature a kind of luxuriance of property and property in very sort of decadent descriptions.
I expected you to talk about Madame Bovary. I did.
Yes.
Because they're
It's one of the examples.
There's certain, like those objects that don't belong in a house of her class, in a provincial house like hers, but she has, Laurentière fulminates or talks about how Flaubert, how upset he gets because of the objects that she's putting in her house, the objects that she wants. This is a sort of aggressive version of Locke, that if she gets the signs and tokens of class sensibility, she will actually become that kind of person and be able to live that novelistic life. So you don't see that kind of Bovaryism. There are some English and American Madame Bovarys, but not quite of that.
Right, it almost seems like the opposite paradigm where people are saying yes to the desire for marriage and new kinds of reproductive possibilities, and yet the households are ending up being scattered and dispersed. Nana, for example, or the sentimental education. Anyhow, I just thought it was a really interesting point.
I haven't taken it very much farther than this, early America, to tell you the truth. Yeah. No.
At the end, when you were aligning the post-colonial novel with these early American novels, I was reminded instantly of Larry Buell's idea of American literary emergence as post-colonial phenomenon from the mid-90s. And, and it struck me at first, this is the antithesis, because that emergence is now revealed as a displacement of this earlier emergence that you were describing, and not an emergence in that sense at all. In that argument, Buell is very, there's so many reasons not to like it, and this is another big one.
Okay.
He's very focused on imitation and on the sort of construction of a quasi-neo-colonial elite through imitation. And so I was thinking that thought, but then it struck me that as somebody who doesn't know these early American seduction narratives, I understand them in terms of texts like Eliza Haywood's Phantomina or the London Jilt.
Oh, no.
Those are the, and so
But
what I want to
there
ask,
are definite similarities.
what I want to ask is how do you understand in terms of your paradigm the adaptation or imitation of narrative forms from the continent?
Well, I wouldn't do the whole continent. I risk making great generalizations, but That's not true, I do it all the time. Bad girl. For example, I mean, one of the clearest things, we're talking we're talking seduction novels. I mean, I could do buildings for one, I could do a whole bunch of different subgenres, but the seduction novel, I mean, the only reason that Clarissa can keep on writing is because she's both unconscious and she didn't want to be, to be raped. Okay, once you have a woman sullied in England, she disappears. She is no longer part of the network until later on. In the United States, this is not true. It's much more of a sort of Molly Bloom phenomenon. I mean, Molly Bloom is a wonderful hub, right? Who connects all the men of Dublin who plug into her body, right? So the way that the household as hub works, or the seduction novel works on the periphery, is very, very different. Okay, many of these women get remarried. I mean, I think Locke even has a clause about that. In the United States, women who lose their husbands or get separated from them.
Indians who
What?
Indian women who lose their husbands.
Is he only talking about Indian women? I don't think so. I don't think so. But Warren will decide.
So for you, it's an autochthonous narrative.
But women can be ruined, and very often they're British women who come to the United States or to the colonies because they're ruined, as Mel Flanders did, and they can find other husbands, and their experience during the period of the early Republic, in the last 2 decades of the 18th century and the first decade of the 19th century, the experience of the ruined woman becomes essential to explaining what are the limits, of exogamy, placing limits on out marriage, the kind of guy you want to go out with. I don't know if that makes sense, but they are the ones who.
That's great.
So one of the phrases that I very much liked was I don't know if this is an exact quote, but that you said that you position the seduction novel itself as in the same predicament as its protagonist. I understood that its context, the context in which it has, that is the seduction novel, has its predicament is the market. Is that right? And so one of the things that I was trying to, I was thinking about with respect to your project, your Lens project as a whole, is the question of what you're trying to explain. And my sense is that you're trying to some extent, get at market dynamics. So for example, which novels produce at least minimally successful imitators, which don't. But the question is, do you care how many copies a novel sold? Do you care, are you trying to take account more of the archive of novels in sort of a Foucaultian sense? You're not interested in like, okay, so which one sold better than others, but rather, here's what was possible to make a novel about. I mean, how?
That whole dimension has been left out of this paper. And there's been some really good work on it. I mean, the fact is that when Lenny, I want you to correct me if I get this wrong. Whenever I say the fact is, he's touching him. A lot of work has been done, and the readership, whatever that is, that collective intelligence developed in a very different way in the new United States than it did in Europe. There was no organic past, really, to sort of invoke as your ground. You had people you had small communities. There was no, a novel was written for a local community. They were small, if you know small world theory, which I know you do, they were basically written for the Pennsylvania Dodge Shore. Am I correct on this?
Yeah, we have plenty of evidence that these novels were oftentimes so localized that one novelist would write to another and say, I hear that you've written a novel. Would you send me a copy because I'm living in Philadelphia, and your novel hasn't gotten turned down here yet. After all, the postal system had not yet become nationalized successfully, and there were no roads connecting the entire nation yet.
So a novel had a better chance, if it were written in Philadelphia, of getting back to England than it did to getting to Atlanta or Chicago or someplace else. Okay, that's the way
Chicago
that.
didn't exist yet.
What do you mean? That's my origin. Okay. So, I mean, it's really interesting in network terms because there were much better connections between the Atlantic seaboard and Europe. And one of the things that the novel did was novelists and readers started communicating, and they sent sort of bridge connections across these various local reading communities. Okay, so you start to get that kind of affiliation working against the European, the transatlantic. And so there are a lot of big books that do a beautiful job of that. And we draw on that. Does that help?
Yeah.
It doesn't work like Moretti, which is,
Right.
it's either tree or rhizome. This is not like that. It works much more like some kinds of network theories do, where you start out with a bunch of small whorls, and then you start to throw bridges across, and each one changes the other.
Yeah, no, it does help, but I think it's, I mean, part of what I'm interested in is that, both in your paper, but sort of more generally, is if people take novels that are not, you know, the ones we usually look at, what's the rationale behind it? Is it that you're recovering some brilliant work that was left?
Oh, I see. I get it.
Or is it, well, it was a bestseller in that time?
No, we're not
Exactly.
doing
And
it.
so this strikes me as a more interesting justification, where the point, it isn't important if it sold 10,000 copies, but rather.
The reason we came to it, or he came to it first, I mean, he's written on this more than I have, and was because we used to talk about 18th century novels in America, 18th century novels in England, and even in France, and nobody, none of them were in paperback form. Nobody was reading that back then, except, you know, archivists type people. But it wasn't part of the literary canon. If you look at almost any book that tries to describe our national tradition, it will sort of nod at Brockton Brown as a kind of crank, and then start with Fenimore Cooper, who was writing in France, imitating Scott. And then it will go from there and make other people, it will leave out the confidence man. It will turn Melville's boat into a house or a nation. Okay, I mean, it just started becoming obvious to us. What had happened, because all of this got done in the post-war period, when people were very conscious of remaking, when nations had been terribly compromised by the wars, and there was this really intense concern with making the nation again and using the novel to do it. So we're reacting, we think that, I mean, this is where the contemporary thing comes in. We think that in today's, day and age, everybody's running around saying global this and global that, that, you know, we should get back to this earlier international, pre-national form of the novel, that it's very interesting to us at this moment. Which makes us no better than the post-war canonizers. We're doing something that fits our own moment. It makes it intelligible in interesting ways for us. Yeah.
Yeah, that was actually absolutely my question, was about the relationship to a contemporary impulse and to the question of sort of seeing networks, nodes, and biopolitics wherever one begins to look now. And so I guess I just wanted to ask about the kind of some sort of reflection on the way in which you're doing a biological turning as something that belongs to the exigencies of reading now, or as opposed to something rooted in a self-understanding on some level presented in those texts?
There are definite parallels, okay, formal parallels. I think that the networks have different technology. I think that they work in entirely different ways, okay? But there was something about his work and my interest in the contemporary novel, which I don't think defines, I mean, we're just more interested in showing the forms of community, how human life is conceptualized in those tears in neoliberalism, where, I mean, those forms of community that show the limits and what it leaves out. So that's a very different project than what was going on in the United States. And this is going to help me, working on this is going to help me do more responsible work. So the differences are equally important. But there's something about the exigencies, you know, but the conditions of intelligibility.
Right.
It's, you know, when somebody writes an English novel, I'm not interested today. I'm just not. There's something about it. I mean, what was that Julian Barnes novel that won the Booker several years ago?
Sense Finale.
Please. So bad compared to, you know, Michael Kay or some, you know, all of these novels that are, you know, usually on the list. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about conversion and the relationship
Good.
of.
This is, I understand this the least.
Well, but it raises all kinds of interesting issues because you can understand conversion in two different ways, especially I was thinking in relation to immunity. Because obviously in Communitas by Esposito, the conversion associated with the emergence of Christianity in Paul, in Romans and Corinthians, is sort of the extreme case of the kind of destitution of the self represented by community. And you know, the model of religious conversion, the idea of the Greek koinonia, captures that. And immunity is a response to that, trying to protect the self from this demand for total sacrifice, not just some. But then later, in the period you're talking about, there's another meaning of conversion, which is something like convertibility, which is the interchangeability of every persons and things in a commodity economy.
Not really. See, this is the thing. This is where a couple of people who helped us, there are a couple of graduate students, they probably all fled in mortification, but who helped us work on this. But there's a legal term, I told you about troving, where if you find somebody's cow or chicken or something like that, you are obligated to keep it and give it back to that person. This is a law I think it comes into use between Holmes and Locke. And the thing is that you are guilty of theft if you take that cow and eat it, because then you have turned it into your own substance. So there's some sort of transubstantiation going on here. And this is true in chemistry. There's the one kind of conversion where you turn water into ice. And there's another kind where you turn, you know, one chemical substance into another one. So it's what's important, and conversion is coming into English, in science, in religion, in, you know, with a distinctively Protestant U.S. meaning that had with Protestantism and all those in Behemoth, all those people who were converted by the false prophets.
It's irreversible.
What?
It's irreversible. Irreversible.
Irreversible. It's irreversible change in substance. If I eat your cow, I have stolen It's no longer yours, it's part of my substance. So it cannot, it isn't convertibility like you can turn paper money back into gold. It doesn't have that reversible quality, although both terms are there. The thing about it is that conversion is no longer specifically a religious term during this period. It's being used for all sorts of things. Is that?
Yeah, I would say that I understand what you're saying. Okay, there's yet another idea of conversion or convertibility, separate from what you're saying. But that might be compatible with the most extreme forms of immunization.
I think so. And this is the way it would be. If I take that, if I take land and grow something, mix my labor with it, I actually change its substance. It becomes, in becoming my property, it becomes something other than it was. So that's how it would work in the immunity. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, thank you.